we are connected. And so we're going to go ahead and get started tonight. But thank you all for joining us tonight. We're going to be talking about elk. I'm pretty excited about this. I know it's been a busy week of webinars for us to have 3 nights in a row. So thank you for everyone that's sticking with us and has come to us with a lot of questions and a lot of interesting stuff. I've learned a lot talking with Casey and with Rex earlier in the week, and I'm excited to talk to Travis about elk tonight. I wanted to remind people of a few important deadlines. If you were hoping to apply for bear and turkey, hopefully you got that done because that draw did close at 5 o'clock tonight. Tuesday is the next important draw that you need to, the next important deadline that you need to be aware of. And that's when harvest reports are due for deer, elk, pronghorn, and turkey. And if you don't get them submitted by the 15th of February, you do have until the 16th of March, but there is a late fee associated with that. So why not get them in early and save yourself a few bucks? So that deadline is, again, February 15th, next Tuesday. And then, of course, the big deadline is March 16th at 5 p.m. So don't forget those and start getting those in your calendar if you haven't applied already. For those of you that are here in the Zoom room, we do have our question and answer box up and going. So if you have any questions, please feel free to type them in there. I'll try to keep an eye on the chat as well, but sometimes that gets a little bit crowded. For those of you on Facebook, we'll also do our best to track those comments and bring in your questions, especially the ones that are relative to the conversation. We have a lot of people that are joining us here tonight, so we will do our best to get to everyone's questions. We do have our Spanish translator in the participants. So if you guys have a question in Spanish, we'd be happy to bring Darren in and have him translate for us. And I think, Travis, that is all of my housekeeping stuff. So I wanted to let you start off. Tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Sure. Yeah. Hi, everybody that's tuned in online. Thanks for joining us. My name is Travis Zaffarano. I'm the Elk Program Coordinator for the New Mexico Department of Game and Fish. And basically what that means is I don't want to say in charge, but I oversee most of what goes on in across the state in terms of elk management and setting regulations for hunt rules throughout the state. That entails doing population monitoring, and I'm involved in facilitating some of the research that happens with New Mexico State University. Every 4 years, and this is one of those years, I'm involved with the rule cycle, wherein we take recommendations from law enforcement and our regional wildlife biologists, as well as public input, and use that to kind of help guide our hunt recommendations on a 4-year cycle. I'm also in charge of facilitating and managing all of the monitoring projects across the state for monitoring elk populations. And then just kind of acting as steward for the elk, at least on public lands across the state. I do work somewhat hand in hand with the E+ coordinator, which we heard from on Monday, Rex Martinson. He deals with a lot of the private lands ends of elk management across the state. I deal with more of the public lands part of elk management in the state.
That's great. And I know it's a very busy job. Elk are very popular, both to hunt and to see, to go out and view. And I wanted to go back just a little bit because I know, like myself, you are a transplant. And so before you came to New Mexico, where were you and what were you doing?
So I've only been in Santa Fe for 2 years now. I started in this position on March 9th, which was 4 days before we all went home to do our jobs from our home offices. So it was a pretty steep learning curve for me, learning the new job in a new place where nothing was open. But before I came here, I did my master's degree at the University of Wyoming, wherein I researched elk migrations in and out of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem and the use of remote photography or trail cameras to classify some of those migratory herds. And we looked not only at herd classification, but also herd migration timing, and used that as a tool or developed that tool for Wyoming Game and Fish to be able to collect some of that data remotely as opposed to flying some of those herds every year. So I left the University of Wyoming in the fall of 2018. I spent a little bit of time in Laramie, where the university is. I worked for a consulting firm there for most of 2019, and then I started here in March of 2020.
Great. Great. And it's just, yeah, go Cowboys. Exactly. I spent time in Wyoming as well. So go Pokes.
Right.
Since you've been here a couple of years, I know that things have definitely been a little bit different with COVID and restrictions and the number of people we can have on different projects. But what does, the day in your job look like, or maybe even the year? What kind of do you do throughout the year?
Yeah, so it's kind of just based on the season and what year it is. Right now I'm involved in a lot of meetings with regional wildlife biologists, as well as the field ops or the law enforcement officers within the game department, talking about moving forward with elk management. What do we want to see? What recommendations do we have for the next 4 years on the elk rule? So traveling around a little bit, talking with some of those folks. Also doing a lot of population modeling. So taking the data that we have from both hunter harvest reports as well as our annual flight surveys, compiling that data, putting it into our modeling, use statistical modeling, a sex age kill model to estimate populations in areas where we monitor populations, and then using another population reconstruction model to look at population performance in areas where we don't do surveys, and that relies heavily upon that harvest information. Later in the late spring, early summer, I do a lot of field work with New Mexico State University, get out on the ground, and then also with the helicopter we use to facilitate or aid in some of our captures of elk calves. We have a long running study. This is, I believe, the 5th year on that project, where we're looking at elk herd demographics and the potential impacts of the recovery of the Mexican gray wolf. So I go down and I help out with some of that. And then and various other summer projects. I have another project coming online this year where we're looking at improving some habitat in a well-known calving habitat near Mount Taylor. We're looking to do some habitat improvement there so that we can hopefully improve calf recruitment and bolster that population. And then in the fall, it's a lot of planning and coordinating for those fall surveys. We fly most of our primary management zones in both the north and the south part of the state, wherein we do classifications of elk from a helicopter. And so there's a lot of planning and moving parts that go into that process. And then I also do some of the other flight surveys for different species across the state, whether it be pronghorn, oryx, deer, just various things. I have kind of an iron gut, so I get up in the helicopter and the plane quite often and help out with those surveys. So it's a mix of being in the office and being out in the field, and I love every minute of it.
But I think people would argue that you have one of the best jobs in the state.
I won't argue with them.
So I told you just like 10 minutes ago that I would stick to the outline pretty closely, and I'm going to deviate from it right away. Because I think one of our questions that came in, it's a question that I get fairly frequently, and I think it's a great place to start. But looking at hunting, can you eat both the males and the females, or do the males tend to kind of hold that funk?
I mean, you can absolutely eat both male and female elk. The typical rule is that mature bulls tend to be a little bit more gamey or a little less tender, and a good reason for that is that annual testosterone spike during the rut. The testosterone kind of just takes over those big rutting bulls, changes their behavior in a way that they don't eat as much during the fall. They're more interested in protecting their harem and running off other bulls, and so they go through this cycle of eating a lot during the summer and putting on some of that winter fat, and then just starving themselves during the rut. and then just have all that testosterone running through their body. And so, a few years of that will definitely make the bull meat a little bit more gamey, a little bit more tough, depending on the cut. And then obviously cows, kind of the rule of thumb is the younger, the tastier. Ideally, the calves are really, really quite delicious, but there's not a lot to them. My favorite thing is, and it's difficult to tell the age of an elk until you have it, in hand, but my favorite is probably a 2 to 3 year old cow, because, they still are young and tender, but there's a lot of meat there.
Great. Well, thank you. I was lucky enough to draw an Arizona tag in 2016, and I harvested a young bull, and it was fabulous eating. it was just fun, and it was during the rut, so I was very lucky. But okay, jumping back into our outline, I want to start with just some of the very basics. And so, tell me a little bit about the elk that we have here in New Mexico. What species are they, and how do they differ from other elk across the country?
Sure. Here in New Mexico, we have Rocky Mountain elk, Cervus canadensis nelsonii for the scientific out there. And believe it or not, all of the elk that are in the state now are the result of a transplanting effort in the early 1900s. As westward expansion and a lot of that resource utilization moved its way westward, and New Mexico has settled, a lot of the elk, or all the elk rather, across the state were extirpated. And that included a subspecies called the Merriam's elk, which is now extinct. It used to range across the Southwest, mostly in New Mexico and Arizona. But yeah, we started reintroducing them from a population in Yellowstone. We started bringing them down here in, I believe, 1910. And so all of the elk in New Mexico are a result of those reintroduction efforts in the early 1900s. But there are now 3 subspecies of elk across the United States. There used to be 5. And again, here in New Mexico, we have the Rocky Mountain elk. It's the most common elk in North America. It is the elk that has the subspecies that has the potential for the largest antlers. We also have, or not we, but in North America, we have the Tule elk, and those are common in the western mountains of California, excuse me. The Roosevelt elk in the Pacific Northwest, starting in Northern California, in those coastal ranges running up into Oregon. Those are the Roosevelt elk, and those are actually the largest in body size. The antlers don't get as large as the Rocky Mountain elk, but the body size is the largest. And then the two extinct subspecies are the Merriam's elk, like I mentioned earlier, and then the Eastern elk, which ranged much of the Eastern Plains east of the Mississippi and into Appalachia before that westward expansion, and much of them were extirpated through hunting and overharvest.
Very interesting. So how are the elk here in New Mexico doing? So how many elk do we have, and how are the herds doing across the state?
Well, luckily for me, I can report to you that the elk in New Mexico are doing great. We have an estimated 80 to 100,000 elk across the state. And, that's a large range because you can't actually go out and count every elk, nor can you send them a census in the mail. And so there's a little bit of wiggle room there. It's a statistical estimate, but anywhere between 80 and 100,000 elk in the state. And doing some of the performance and population modeling that I've been doing lately indicates that all of the populations are either stable or slightly increasing, with the exception of the Mount Taylor herd, which is indicating that it's starting to rebound. We're starting to get higher calf-cow ratios there than we had prior to 2018, but we're still trying to buffer that population a little bit until we know for sure that we have a solid population there for harvest. So yeah, so elk are doing great in the state. That we have wonderful habitat throughout the state. It's a great place for them. They don't really have to worry about the harsh conditions of winter in the northern Rocky Mountain states that they do in Wyoming, Colorado, Montana. So yeah, so the elk are doing wonderful here.
That's good to hear. And so where can they typically be found throughout the year, throughout the different seasons? Where would you tend to look for them? Yeah,
so elk, Rocky Mountain elk here, they act pretty similarly to those in northern Rocky Mountain states. So you're going to see a little bit of that seasonal movement between summer and winter. Wintertime right now, a lot of those elk are pushed out of the high elevations because of deep snow and really cold conditions. So they're down in the lower elevations. Probably much to the chagrin of a lot of private landowners. Some of those elk like to be out on pasture and irrigated croplands. So really anywhere that they can be in a lower elevation where the snow isn't too deep, that they can paw through the snow that's there, or find themselves on windswept ridges to get access to what forage is available. And then as spring comes, and that snow melts away, then the grasses and forbs start to green up on the landscape, and they start making their way up in elevation. Elk as well as deer and pronghorn, they'll start making that seasonal migration up and up in that elevation, and utilizing that high quality forage and the abundance of fresh green forage. And then in the summertime, the migratory animals, or those that make those seasonal movements, they make their way up to the high elevation, mixed conifer forests, aspen forests, upper montane meadows. Again, they're looking for some of those edge habitats where there's lots and lots of grasses and forbs to eat, and they'll hang out there as long as they possibly can. In some areas of the state, say for instance, the Valles Caldera, that's seasonally, or typically it's a summer into fall seasonal range. But if you have a mild winter that doesn't really put enough snow to push them down to lower elevations, then some of those elk will stay up there year round. So it really is dependent. And again, I guess down in the Gila where we don't see a lot of snow, some of those elk will stay at high elevations, because that's where that was the grasses and forbs that were last to green up. So they're going to hold that nutritional value. Even as they start to senesce, they're going to be dried out less than the stuff that was at the lower elevation on summer range. So the elk will hang out there and eat as much as they can, as long as they can, until those winter conditions push them down. And then in the fall, in the fall, when the winter starts to onset, if you have strong enough or harsh enough conditions, then the elk make their way back down into the lower elevations.
And I know in Wyoming, you worked on some of those big migration corridors where they were moving several hundred miles at a time. Do our elk here in New Mexico migrate on those same scale, or is it kind of a smaller scale when they migrate?
Well, in Wyoming, they're really only moving between like 40 and 50 miles in and out of that greater Yellowstone ecosystem. You may be referring to the long distance mule deer migration from the Red Desert to the Hoback Junction, which is over 150 miles, which is rather impressive for any ungulate, or any animal for that matter, unless you have wings, then it's a lot easier. But in New Mexico, we don't have the really large, expansive mountain ranges like they do up in Wyoming. With the exception of, north of Taos, the Sangre de Cristos are pretty impressive range. But for the most part, those that are moving seasonally, they're not moving more than probably maybe 20, 25 miles from one seasonal range to the next.
Okay, so shorter. And you're right, I did have my species confused there.
That's okay.
So looking throughout the year in how they're moving, are the group size changing and the group dynamics, the bull-cow ratio in a herd, are those changing? And how does the rut, how does that come to effect? When does it start here in New Mexico?
Yeah, so that's a good question. Elk social dynamics is an interesting topic, and they do change their grouping strategies according to which season they're in. For the most part, outside of the rut, which down here is pretty much the month of September, leads into the first week of October. I've definitely heard reports of bulls bugling into late October, which isn't unheard of. But for the most part, that rut is going to be the month of September leading into October. Outside of that season, a lot of those bulls, especially the herd bulls, those that tend to be, the ones that are driving the harems and grouping them up and have the highest breeding potential. A lot of those guys are hanging out in the deep timber, away from as much responsibility as they possibly can. They're off in some of the kind of, I don't want to say marginal habitat, but it's harder for some of those habitats to withstand the grazing pressure from large groups of cows and calves. So the bulls will separate themselves, and they'll hang out. Sometimes they'll be grouped up. It's not uncommon to see groups of bulls together, but they tend to separate themselves once the breeding season is over, or shortly thereafter. And cows, calves, yearlings. So last year's calves, which the year after will be spikes. They'll all pretty much hang out together until that cow, about halfway through the weaning cycle of that next year's calf, and then they start kind of getting real agitated with the spikes, and that kind of kick them off. And so sometimes when we're doing our survey, I feel bad for those spikes, because you'll run into a group of like 10 or 15 spikes that really don't know what to do with themselves, because they're getting kicked off by the herd bulls that are coming in, and they don't know where to go or what to do. So, but as soon as that breeding season's over, they're right back with their moms and the cow and calf group. So, but yeah, other than that, they are a fairly social and gregarious species. The cow and calf groups, they stay together year round. They travel together. It's a predator evasion tactic. You got more eyes out there looking across the horizon to look for predators. And yeah, they help to raise each other's young, not in the suckling sense, but in the sense that there's, like one cow can go off and explore, another area or go to get water, and the calves will stay together in kind of a nursery group, and yeah, they kind of facilitate each other's rearing of young in that way.
That's quite interesting. I guess that makes a lot of sense, but it wasn't something I thought about before. So that does. So going back, you were talking a little bit ago about the surveys that you conduct, and the getting up in the helicopters and collecting information. I know you also do some ground surveys. What are all the ways that you collect information, and how do you use that to make a scientific-based recommendation going into like rural setting processes?
Sure. Yeah. So that's a big part of my job right now. Coming into the rural cycle, is just looking at the populations, looking at how robust they are, and whether or not we can shift licenses in one direction or another. So just to kind of reiterate, in the primary management zones, which are most of the mountainous regions across the state, it's where we have the densest populations of elk. We fly helicopter surveys between usually about 200 feet off the ground, where it's just the most efficient way to find large groups of elk and classify them. We are trying to institute some ground surveys in areas where it's a little more difficult to assess those populations from the sky. But essentially what we're looking at there is we're looking at herd ratios, demographics. So we're looking at cow-calf ratios, we're looking at bull-cow ratios, and then looking at the number of spikes, right? So cow-calf ratios obviously are an indices of recruitment or reproduction. Sorry. So how many calves were born that year, and how many of them have survived to that fall? And luckily down here, like I mentioned earlier, we don't have really much concern for winter kill. A lot of the northern states, they do their surveys in January post-harvest, because some of those calves won't survive. And so it's a little bit of a bias indices to look at that before the harvest starts and before winter. But down here, we used to do surveys in January, but it's really difficult to get a good number on the bulls when they're not grouped up in the rut. They like to hang out in areas that are very, very difficult to find them. So we're looking at those cow-calf ratios, bull-cow ratios, and then the spike-cow ratio, or rather, the spike-cow ratio, but also just how many spikes are on the landscape gives us an indices of recruitment. So how many of those calves from last year have survived to the next year. Because for the most part, the sex ratio for elk is 1 to 1. So 50% of the calves born are female, 50% of the calves born are male. So in any given year, you can look at the number of spikes that you're observing and assume that the same percentage of calves survived from the prior year. And then using that information, and we combine that with our hunter harvest information, and that gives us just kind of an indices of kind of hunt effort, as well as the percentage of license holders that were successful in that year. It also gives us our estimated mortality rate. So we use that information, we combine those into a sex age kill model for our primary management zones. And that essentially is a statistical model that takes all that information into account, and then gives you a range of the population to say, given all of these indices, this is the size of the population that you should have on the landscape. Outside of primary management zones, so in some of the secondary management zones, or in areas that we don't technically estimate populations in secondary zones, but in areas outside of the primary management zones that we are interested in the population size, then we use just a population reconstruction model, which takes into account your herd ratios, so your bull cow ratios, cow ratios, and as well as the average harvest rate over the last 2 years. And there's another statistical model where you plug in that information, and it essentially tells you, given this information, looking back retrospectively, you would need a population of this size to be able to support that type of harvest, given your harvest rates are, say, 35% success.
So you had mentioned that the calf ratio is typically approximately 1 to 1, kind of a 50% male, 50% female. And we got a comment, and it kind of got me thinking about that as well. But do spikes tend to have a higher mortality, or what ends up changing in the dynamics? Because I know as they get older, we tend to have a higher cow to bull ratio. So what ends up changing in the dynamics over time to adjust those numbers?
Yeah, sure. So that the spike is really just an index of how many are surviving for that first year. Beyond that, you really can't tell the age of an elk, especially cows, unless it's a really old, kind of decrepit cow. Then you can tell it's really old. But from the air, you can't differentiate a 3-year-old from a 7-year-old cow. But in that instance, it doesn't really make much difference, because cows, once they reach the age of 2, then they're already in the reproductive pool. But for males, for most species, tend to have lower survival rates. They tend to be higher risk takers. In the instance of bull elk, once you get to a status or a size where you think that you want to challenge the herd bull, sometimes there's injury involved in that, or even direct mortality. There's definitely cases where elk are puncturing each other with their antlers. They are weapons. And then they also, some of those bulls, like I mentioned earlier, they're out doing their bachelor thing in smaller groups, and sometimes are more susceptible to predation in that way. But also, especially here, and with many of the hunt models in Western states, we tend to harvest heavy on the bulls, because you don't need that many bulls to keep a population of elk. One bull can sire many calves through many cows, in the way that their breeding structure is set up.
Interesting. That makes complete sense. I especially like that they're higher risk takers, because I think that's true in nearly every species out there.
Absolutely.
So going back to the survey information, is there any way that a hunter can send in a tooth that can be aged after they harvest an elk? Or are you aware of any way that they can get an age on their elk afterwards?
That's a really good question. And I've had a few people contact me via email to say, hey, I harvested this, magnificent 6-point bull. I'm just curious if you can give me an age. And in that instance, I try to get them to send me pictures of the lower jaw, because if you look at the premolars and the molar wear patterns, you can do an estimate of age. But certainly there is a technique where you can send in one of the front incisors, the lower incisors. You can send that off to a lab and have them age it. It's called cementum annuli. Essentially, elk put on a ring of I'm forgetting the name of the material, but basically the enamel. They put on a layer of enamel every year of their life. And we don't at this point have anything set up through the department where we can send off teeth to have them aged. If anybody wants the information for the lab, that one of I think 3 labs that we can deal with to do that, then we can either have it sent in with one of our large batches of bear and cougar teeth, because we do a lot of tooth analysis for those populations, or the hunter can send them to the labs themselves. It tends to be cheaper if you do it in a large batch for the lab. But to that point, one of the things that I would really like to start instituting in this position is, especially in areas where we have quality hunt management zones and areas where we're trying to kind of promote older age class bulls. I would really like to send out a random sample of tooth bags with those mature bull licenses, because it would be a really good data set for us to understand kind of the average age of harvested animals, especially bulls that are coming out. I know some of the northern states do this. Wyoming Game and Fish does this, and it really just comes down to funding source. It's something that I'm working on right now, and I'm hoping to be able to institute it in the next year or so. So be on the lookout for that. Don't be surprised if in the next few years you get a little tooth sample bag with some instructions on how to submit that to us. And the idea is it would be to no cost to the hunter. You just send that back into us, and then we would send it in with our bear and cougar teeth and have it analyzed. And then, we'd post the results online anonymously with, maybe your license number or something like that.
Oh, that would be very interesting. I can't wait to see that go into effect and the results of that information. One of the things, jumping ahead on our outline a little bit, but one of the things that can help limit a population, or maybe not help, but can limit a population, is disease. And so when we look at disease in elk, I know CWD is potentially a big one, but what diseases do you keep an eye on throughout the year, or work with our disease specialists to monitor?
Yeah, so CWD is really the only one in the state that we continually monitor for. There's I think 3 GMUs in the southeastern part of the state, 19, 28, and 36. 34. That CWD has been detected. It's in fairly low prevalence. We only get like 1 or 2 positive hits every couple of years. It's a higher prevalence in deer, but it's certainly something that we want to keep an eye on. Outside of that, there's sarcoptic mange, which is a type of skin mite, which can cause irritation and hair loss in some areas. It's rather unsightly, but it's really irritating for the animal that's infested with those skin mites. But it's not really dangerous to their health in any way. There is a parasitic kind of heartworm called Eliophora, which can really restrict capillary vessels, arteries, bloodways, and basically create a constriction in the arteries and veins, which can essentially lead to heart attack or really difficulties in the animal's ability to function well. There hasn't been any detected Eliophora for quite some time. I know back in the late 60s it was detected in the Gila, but it's not something that crops up all that often. And then there's blue tongue disease or blue tongue virus, which is a viral infection, which can manifest itself in similar ways to CWD, kind of loss of appetite, loss of muscle tissue, and then epizootic hemorrhagic disease, which is another viral infection that presents itself similar to CWD. And there was believed to be an outbreak of that in the northeast part of the state near Las Vegas, I believe in 2013, where there was about 100 elk that just ended up passing away, and mysteriously, we were trying to figure out what was going on there, and I believe that was EHD. So we monitor it when it comes up, whenever there's a situation that arises where there's an animal that presents with some of these symptoms. Sometimes that animal will need to be harvested, and then samples taken and sent into the lab, and then in any case where we do get a positive on any of those diseases outside of CWD, then we make an effort to go ahead and try to monitor that. But the good news is, outside of CWD, the verdict is kind of out on that. Some people read into it a little bit differently. There's been many results or many studies done on that topic. As far as I know, CWD positive animals are still safe to eat. There's really like a very, very small chance of transmission, and that was really only found in like the test monkeys where they had them ingest infected deer brain material, which I don't know how many hunters are out there actually eating brain material or spinal cord. So don't do that if it's something that it's a delicacy at your home. Maybe shy away from that. But any of the other diseases that I mentioned, blue tongue, Eliophora, or EHD, those animals are still safe to consume.
Yes, and I would tell people that if you're interested in learning more about these, we did a podcast about 2 months ago, I believe, with Carrie Maurer, who is our disease specialist, and he talked about a lot of these same diseases and had some recommendations, and not just about elk, but about all kinds of species across the board. So definitely check out that podcast if you're interested in wildlife diseases. So shifting gears a little bit, I know that there's been several hunters calling into the department and asking questions. And so when someone calls you and asks for your recommendations when they're applying for elk, what do you tell them? Where do you start?
Well, it all kind of depends on how much homework they've done. I certainly have some folks that call me that, they don't really know much about the public draw or elk hunting opportunities in the state whatsoever. And so, in that case, I just kind of lead them towards some of the resources that we have, or I'll send them some of the information that we have about the various options for elk hunting in the state. And then I also have folks that, have definitely spent some time doing their homework, and they've got a list of say 5 different units that they are considering putting in for the draw. And if for my end of things, it makes it a lot easier when folks call me and they've done some homework and they've really kind of looked into what they want to do, and they have some ideas about where they might want to take their hunt. But certainly, if I were to just give some general guidance to those that are wanting to put in for either the public draw or the private, just kind of spend some time to think about what type of hunt you're looking for. Do you want to go and chase down that 400-inch bull? Are you really interested in those quality hunt management zones, a quality hunt, or are you just looking to harvest either sex or maybe an antlerless cow tag, and you want to just put some meat on the table? Really, spend some time thinking about that, because there are different tag options out there that have different draw odds. And if you're just looking to put meat on the table, maybe a mature bull tag in a quality hunt management zone isn't the first choice, because it's a very, it's a lower chance of being drawn. Then I would start to look at the success rates for the specific hunts that you're looking into. we have that information online. Our elk harvest reports, I think they go back at least 5 years. So start, get yourself an idea of what kind of tags you want to buy. Look at success rates. Look at the draw odds. Look at the draw odds reports. Those are also available online. And then I'll give you an idea of kind of what your chances are for drawing that particular hunt, given how many people put in for that license last year, whether they are non-resident or resident. And kind of, you got to do a little bit of math to figure out what your actual percentages are, but at least it'll give you an idea of how many people are putting in for those areas. The other thing is, don't put all your eggs in one basket. Some people think, well, if I put my first, second, and third choice all for the same hunt, it increases my chances. Well, it does, but when you're 3 licenses in a pool of 2,500, you'd probably be better off just spreading your odds, putting those first, second, and third choices in different areas, or maybe even for different weapon types or different sexes. You probably are going to have a higher likelihood of drawing going that route. I guess the only other thing I would think.
I'll mention, sorry to interrupt you. One other thing to think about when you're applying and putting the same unit multiple times is that the way our draw system works is that every application is generated a random number. So if your number comes up, it will start with your first choice and see, oh, is that hunt filled? If it's not filled, it goes to your second. If it's not filled, you get your first choice. If that one's filled, then it goes to your second and to your third. And so if they're all the same hunt and they've all filled by the time your sequence gets there, then you're SOL and don't get anything. So always keep that in mind when you're looking at those 3 choices and really think that through. Sorry to interrupt you.
No, that's okay. The only other things I would think of is don't be afraid to travel. Don't put in for units that are only an hour away from your back door, because you may or may not get it, and there may be a unit 3 or 4 hours away that has a higher draw. So don't be afraid to travel. It's not that big of a state. I mean, it is, but it isn't. And then also don't shy away from those fourth choice hunts, or the population management hunts. If you're not drawn through the public draw, those 4th and 5th choice options are there to give you another chance. And the way that the 4th choice, I know I'm going to lead into the next segue here. The fourth choice is basically, if you're not drawn for your first, second, or third choice, the 4th option is basically, if there are leftover licenses through the draw, then you put your name in the hat for one quadrant of the state. And there's 4 quadrants: northwest, northeast, southwest, southeast. And if you're drawn for that, then it may not necessarily be the weapon type that, it'll match the weapon type of your first choice, but it may not necessarily be the hunt that you're looking for. It might not be the unit you want, and it might not be the sex that you're looking for. And then for 5th choice, that puts you into the pool for population management hunts. And again, if you have the chance to be called up, just a few weeks before the actual hunt, and which in case you may luck out.
Absolutely. And on those 4th and 5th choices that you just mentioned, is that only for residents, or can non-residents apply for those as well?
That's a good question. I think that the 4th choice is available to non-residents, and I don't think that population management hunts are available to residents. At least the ones that I've been involved with establishing and working with. Oftentimes we even limit the pool of folks that are selected for those hunts to certain zip codes that are in close proximity to that area. Because sometimes those guys won't get a call until 2 weeks before the hunt to say, hey, are you interested in a tag? And then that, it makes it a little easier for somebody that lives a little closer to make plans, with their work arrangements or whatever they need to do.
I was just checking the definition while you were talking, and it doesn't specify residents or non-residents, but we can definitely look into that. If you reach out to us, we can do some more investigation. And so when you're applying, you said you have the first 3 choices, and can you mix and match your weapon type, or does it all have to be archery equipment or a muzzleloader or rifle?
No, you can absolutely mix and match your weapon types, hunt units, sex, quality, or standard license fee. No, it's not biased towards your first option weapon choice or anything like that. It's just each weapon type has its own hunt code. Each hunt has its own hunt code, and so it's divvied out in that way. It's divvied out by hunt code specifically. So no, you don't have to lock yourself into doing just archery or just muzzleloader.
Okay. And another question that I get frequently, because of the way the elk structure is set up and that you pay a higher price for the high quality hunts, in that price structure changes just a little bit depending on what kind of elk hunt you apply for. So if I apply for a high quality hunt and maybe a regular or more typical elk hunt, which price am I charged? And how do the refunds work depending on what I'm drawn?
Yeah, so if you put in for a mixed bag, and one of those is a quality or high demand hunt with a higher license fee, then yeah, we do ask that you pay the higher license fee. But then if you're drawn for one of the standard license fee hunts, then you're refunded that balance between the higher license fee and the standard license fee.
Very, very great. I always like to put in for, my first choice, something that's a little bit more high demand. And then my third choice, just the opportunity to go. And so sometimes that you don't always get your first choice, but sometimes it's nice just to have the opportunity to go.
Sure.
And looking at those, how do the encouragement hunts go? And do you know how old you have to be if you're on the youth side, what the age restrictions are on their encouragement hunts?
Sure. Yeah. The encouragement hunts are exactly that. Initially, they are a youth encouragement hunt, so they're designed to try to get some of our younger hunters out there, get them the experience to go out and hunt elk, kind of instill some of those values. It's important for us to get younger hunters out on the landscape because that next generation is important to help fund conservation of big game species. And so the way that it's set up is the encouragement hunts, and they'll go on sale about mid-July. And for the first 14 days, those licenses are available for purchase for New Mexico residents only, ages 17 and younger. And after the 14-day period is over, then those licenses become available as well to New Mexico resident seniors who are age 65 and older. Mm-hmm. And so typically there are leftover licenses. Not all of those hunts, especially with the muzzleloader youth encouragement hunts, not all the muzzleloader hunts sell, and some of the rifle hunts don't all sell either. I know 14 days is a long period to wait for those seniors that are really kind of chomping at the bit to see if they can get one of those tags. But that's the way it works. Is we try to give that opportunity to the youth first. And also for any of those folks that want to buy an encouragement license, you have to have put in for a big game draw that license year and been unsuccessful. So you need to put in for one of the big game species in the state and be unsuccessful in the public draw to be able to be eligible for that encouragement hunt.
Great. And we got the question the other night, and I just wanted to throw it out there that if somebody did apply for the bear and turkey draw and are successful in that, but not successful in the elk, deer, and pronghorn, they would still qualify for those youth encouragements and or senior, the encouragement hunts. So it was a question we got the other night, and I wanted to share that information with everybody. One of the things I noticed going through the rules and information booklet is that some of the hunts are only available to residents. And so can you talk a little bit about what hunts are only available to residents versus the ones that non-residents can apply for?
Sure. Any antlerless hunt. So all the cow tags that are allocated through the public draw are for New Mexico residents only, as well as any hunts that occur on wildlife management units. And so that's for antlerless either sex or mature bull tags. If it's on a WMA and you're hunting elk, you better be a resident because you won't get a license otherwise. And in addition to that, all of the other licenses that are allocated through the public draw, there's a quota established through state statute, wherein 86% of those licenses do go to New Mexico licenses or New Mexico residents, excuse me. 10% of those will go to, I have my math wrong, it's 84%, excuse me. 84% go to New Mexico residents. 10% of those will go to outfitters that are outfitting either New Mexico residents or non-residents, and then the remaining 6% will go to non-residents if they do apply for those licenses. So the idea there is to try to give as much opportunity to the folks that do live here in the state.
And those numbers are set in statute, I believe. So I know that there's a lot of questions that come up about those breakouts with the 84, 10, 6, but it's what we operate under through statute. So great. Well, I know we've been talking a long time, but I want to jump through some of the questions, and there are a significant number of them. So bear with me. I'm going to start with the ones that we got before the session, and that I shared those with you. But what are the units with the greatest amount of hunting opportunity and public hunting opportunity? It's someone that wants to be, semi-guided or really a DIY hunt.
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, so the way that the public draw hunts are established, we have both quality hunt management and opportunity or optimal opportunity management zones. And those are designated in, I believe they're designated in the rule and information booklet. You should be able to determine which is which through the rule booklet. And there's going to be more opportunity in the opportunity management zones, believe it or not. And that's, and we design it that way specifically to try to offer as much opportunity as we can without negatively impacting the performance of the herd or the population out there. The quality hunt management zones, we tend to limit the number of licenses. They're shifted a little bit closer to the rut, so you have a little bit better experience and a higher chance of maybe harvesting one of those trophy bulls. If you're looking for opportunity, I would maybe shy away from the quality hunt management areas, and then obviously don't be afraid to apply for a cow license. In some of those areas, some of the cow licenses outnumber the bull licenses. I'm not having any like GMUs pop into mind, except for maybe 51. 51 is a really popular unit. Looking at the draw odds from last year, I think there was like 2,000 applicants, but there's also just it's one of the highest numbers of tags given out. So yes, there's a lot of people that put in for those licenses, but there's an abundance of licenses. So I would take a look at those draw odds, compare the number of licenses that are available with the number of people that are applying to those units. And just kind of, it's a little bit of a numbers game. You got to kind of investigate a little bit, try to figure out where it makes sense for you.
And I'll let everybody know that, and I believe it's a week from Monday, we have Kevin Brodden, who's going to join us on a webinar and really delve into the draw odds reports and the harvest reports, and how that you can use that information to make an educated decision when applying for the draw. So definitely check that one out for those of you that really like to get into the odds reports. So Travis, the next question I have is, how often do elk come to water? And the question was specific for late season. And it's funny because 51 was mentioned in this question as well. And I apologize, Ryan, because I know you want us to stop naming units, but it was in the question, so we're going to throw it out there again. So how often do they come to water in late season, and really during the early season as well? Does that number change?
Yeah, certainly it changes a little bit based on what the weather's doing. You know, as we transition into the hotter months, they're going to be a little bit more heat stressed, and they're going to want to water depending. And then again, depending on physiological constraints or pressure, you know, elk cows that are late in estrus, they require probably the most water. So they will water once a day, twice a day, depending on where they are in that pregnancy. Outside of that, you know, it's maybe once every 2 days. In the wintertime, you know, they don't have to necessarily go to water, because there's not as much heat loading on them, and they're not as heat stressed. Obviously they still need water, but you know, they can eat snow. And so once every 2 to 3 days, maybe in the wintertime is probably a good estimate.
Great. And about what elevation would you find elk, depending on the snowpack, obviously, in those November months?
Oh, geez. It all depends on where you are, right? I mean, down in the Gila, those elk are going to be at 8,000 or 9,000 feet if there's no snow. If there's snow pushing in November, there's probably not going to be snow, so they're going to be, you know, 8,000 or 9,000 feet. But up in the Sangre de Cristos or the San Juans, you know, if there's snow on the ground, I'd be looking between 6,000 and 8,000, you know, or 7,000 and 8,000. I know that's a huge range, but elk are, you know, they're resilient creatures. They'll find themselves comfortable in areas and in conditions that you wouldn't expect. So it's kind of dependent on the elk, I guess, dependent on the habitat. That's one of the joys of working in ecology, is you can always say it depends on scale.
That is so true.
So I apologize, Ryan, for not really getting a good answer for you on that one, but you can call me later and discuss it if you want.
Perfect. And another fun question, I don't know. I always think it's an interesting one, but how does the moon, a full moon versus no moon, how is that going to affect elk and their schedules for feeding and watering?
You know, to be quite honest, I don't really know how to answer that question. I could speculate, but I feel like I would be maybe leading some people astray, and I don't want to do that. Anecdotally, you know, some animals tend to be more active during a full moon because they can see potential threats. But I don't know that is necessarily universal across the board. So sorry to whoever submitted that one. I don't have a good answer for you.
Great. Okay, I'm gonna try and get through several of the questions in our Q&A that I haven't been able to respond through texting at this point. But do you know the success with archery, at least on a statewide basis, or an average success rate?
Oh, geez, you're putting me on the spot. It's at the very bottom of the harvest report, and it's typically higher in private on private hunts. I want to say, if I can remember this right, it's on private lands. It's closer to 40%. On public lands, I want to say archery success rates are between 25 and 33%. Yeah, there's a statewide average breakdown for weapon type and private versus public at the bottom of the harvest reports.
Okay, and I think it's easiest for people to find those if you go to our website and use the site search function. It's very, very user friendly in my opinion, and just search harvest reports and they should pull up for all of the species in there. Okay, one of the people in our Zoom and his daughter, who's 15, are new to hunting. They applied last year but didn't really know a good place to look for elk. Any advice? And it's a multiple part question, so any advice, any books that you can recommend, or places that they can go to get good information?
Well, there are quite a few youth only hunts across the state, and a lot of those are designed to be, you know, to try to offer as much opportunity for those youth hunters. So we put them in the beginning of say the rifle or the muzzleloader season to try to give them the opportunity to get the jump on the elk before you get a bunch of hunters running around out there. And those are available. Those are public draw license hunts, and they're available to residents, non-residents, so long as you're 17 and under. And I would certainly advise them to maybe put in for some of those, because they do have fairly decent draw odds. There's not a lot of folks that put in for those. I think you probably have a better chance of drawing that than you would just a regular public draw. And man, probably the most useful resources for a young hunter, outside of Bugle Magazine. Bugle Magazine, put out by Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, is a wonderful resource for learning about elk behavior, what they do, some hunting strategies, depending on what type of weapon you're using, or what your hunt style is. There's lots of good tidbits and stuff in there about hunting itself, and maybe there's somebody, I'm not well versed in the literature outside of the scientific literature realm, so maybe there's somebody in the chat group that can suggest some other sportsman's literature that might be helpful for them. Outside of that, there is, it's a tome of a book. It's probably about this thick. It's called North American Elk Management and Ecology, I think. It's published by the Smithsonian Institute. I believe the second edition came out in 2012. It's kind of like it's the elk Bible. I reference it quite often. It tends to be a little thick in the scientific explanation of things, but they do a pretty good job of breaking things down in layman's terms as well. So you can kind of read into it what you want, but it breaks down behavior, movements, all sorts of different things that have to do with elk, and maybe not necessarily hunting elk, but understanding elk anyway. So get yourself in that mindset. That's really good way to be successful.
Great advice. And earlier, kind of on the same note, but earlier you had mentioned that some hunters call you and have done a lot of research and have some good ideas, and they're just trying to narrow down the units. And so for somebody that's trying to do that research on their own, what recommendations do you have? I know the other night Rex talked about using Google Earth and some of those Google imaging to look for water in different sources, but what other recommendations do you have for somebody that's really trying to delve in and do their homework?
Yeah, I mean, he's not wrong. Google Earth is a great resource. I mean, it's amazing to be able to use that satellite imagery to zoom in to look at, a cattle drinker, and you can even use that to map out some of the hunt routes or some of the roads you want to take to get to certain areas. It is a really useful tool. Its limitations are it doesn't really, unless you have some of the spatial data, it doesn't give you like land ownership status or any of that kind of stuff. You can dig around and find that information through various online platforms. Onyx or the web application or the mobile application that the department developed with BLM called Carry Map is also a pretty good resource. That one's available for free. It's available to download through our department website. It does a pretty good job of at least showing you, land parcels and who owns what. Onyx is kind of a little bit more of an upgraded version of that. It'll give you, landowner information, as well as kind of topographic maps and stuff along those lines. There's just a wealth of information and resources out there. And one of the most invaluable resources is just go scout it on the ground. If you have the time, and the resources, a truck to go bounce around on some of those dirt roads, go do it. If you really are interested in hunting, the fence lake herd, and you want to get a lay of the land, and you wanted to kind of get a better understanding of what the habitat looks like, just go out there and spend some time in it, and really just kind of get a feel, get your bearings, and understand the landscape a little bit better. and I think you'll be better off for it.
Absolutely. Going to a different question that came up, can you speak to what the warm autumn temperatures have done to the normal 24-hour? Oh, sorry, we answered that one already. I apologize. That's the one I was looking for. Have you seen evidence that suggests that once hunting season begins, that you can find pressure causes significant movement out of a particular unit or a particular area versus where you initially counted them in the surveys?
I guess I need a little clarification. Are they asking if the survey pressure is pushing the elk around, or hunt pressure?
I read it as hunt pressure making the herd move around.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I guess it depends on the type of hunt, right? I mean, there's a reason we put the archery hunts first. A couple of reasons. One being it's a little easier to hunt archery when the elk are in rut, and you can maybe call them in. Because you really are limited at the range in which you can shoot an elk with a bow. But also, they're a little naive to that hunt pressure. And so you can't put, your archery hunts after even muzzleloader, because once they start firing off those shells, then they get to be a little bit more wary of what's going on. So certainly there is the potential for elk to be pushed around given hunt pressure. And that's another part of the reason that we limit licenses in our quality hunt management areas, just so there's a little bit less hunt pressure in certain focal areas. And there's literature out there to suggest that elk will move away from a preferred habitat if they're really getting a lot of hunt pressure on them. But if the habitat is really good and that's where they want to be, then they'll find their way back. It just kind of depends on what the hunt pressure and presence is doing in that area. So certainly there is, the potential for elk to be pushed around on the land, but they're not moving into the next county. They're not moving into the next GMU. I mean, even when we're chasing them with a helicopter, they're running when we're counting them. But as soon as we pass back over them, they group back up, they go back to feeding. So they're pretty resilient. They figure it out. Sometimes even those big bulls, we'll fly over them and they'll just look up at us. And then, okay, we counted them, we move on. They didn't even move. Some of them won't even get up out of their beds.
I mean, why should you, right? So one of the people in our Zoom has 80 acres in western New Mexico, and they're looking to help the local wildlife population. So he's wondering if there's anything specific that he can plant that would be beneficial to elk.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it depends on what kind of landscape you have. Obviously, elk are primarily grazers, so they're eating more grasses and forbs than they are subshrubs. Aspen is another really good one, but aspen is a tough one because if it's a young aspen shoot, the elk will just dominate it. They'll decimate it. They'll eat all of the leading growth on those, and it's really hard to establish aspen, even on the natural landscape after a burn. If you have too much grazing pressure, then elk will prohibit aspen from coming back. I would probably, if you're looking to plant something, then I would look into some of the native grasses for the area. I am not the best resource to tell you what species of grass that would be, but if you were to call some of the folks in our habitat department, and if you want to contact me directly, I can get you the phone numbers and emails for the folks that work in our habitat shop, and they do exactly that in some of our revegetation areas. They have to revegetate with some of the native landscape plants, and so yeah, I would contact them and see what their recommendations are. But I think probably the biggest bang for your buck is going to be some sort of native grass.
Great, thank you. So we have a lot of questions still in there, and I know that we've gone a little over our expected time tonight. a couple of things I wanted to tell people. Check out our draw odds session with Kevin coming up. I believe it's a week from Monday. And we're going to delve into some of those questions about the draw odds and the harvest report. So for those of you that are looking for that kind of information, check that out. If you are, I'm trying to group and give people resources because there's a lot of very similar questions. But if you're interested in how applying and attaching applications can affect your draw odds, I would definitely check out our session from January with Ross. I believe it was called How to Apply. And we really walk into that, how to get your first choice, second choice, third choice, how to get your attach codes to attach a party application, and what happens if, say there's not enough tags for if a resident and a non-resident want to attach together. So make sure and check out those if you're interested in the application process. And so, Travis, we've covered a very wide variety of topics here tonight, but is there anything that's coming into your head that we should have talked about or we need to let people know about, or common questions that you get about elk hunting in New Mexico?
I'm trying to review what we have and haven't talked about tonight. There's a lot there. Yeah, I think, my biggest recommendation is just to try to investigate and do as much homework as you can when thinking about a hunt. Don't rule out the possibility of a private hunt. It's a little more difficult in secondary management zones because we don't have a list of landowners through our E+ program. So you kind of got to know a guy who knows a guy who's got some property that might have, some authorizations to sell. But yeah, I would just recommend, doing your homework, try to scout as much as you can before you go on an elk hunt, learn as much as you can about elk behavior and hunting strategies, depending on your hunt weapon. And don't be afraid to get out of the truck and put some miles on. I understand it's a lot of work to pack an elk out. But I feel like there's a lot of folks out there, a lot more UTVs and trucks that are just driving up and down roads. And some of those folks are lucky, don't get me wrong. But I think you're going to have a little higher success rate if you get away from roads. So I can't really think of any golden ticket items that we didn't cover here. I'm sorry.
Well, I want to thank everybody who joined us, and we've had a great attendance and great conversation here in Zoom and on the Facebook platform as well. And I really, really appreciate everybody's engagement. I am going to share the dates one more time to make sure that you can check them out, write them down on your calendar or do a screenshot so that you have them. But Tuesday is the harvest report deadline. Next week, we'll also be having a special webinar as part of our ladies series, and we'll be talking about hunting and the draw process as well. So you're more than welcome to check that out. And then on Wednesday, as a continuing part of this series, talking about big game hunting in New Mexico, we'll be talking with Warren, who is our deer biologist for the state, and another very popular topic. So make sure to get your harvest reports in, and good luck if you applied for the bear and turkey. Lastly, Travis, I really want to thank you for your time tonight. I know you are very busy with the rule setting process that's going on currently, and field work and surveys and everything else that's going on this time of year. So thank you very much for giving us an hour and a half now tonight to talk about elk in New Mexico.
Thanks. Appreciate it.
All right. Good night, everyone.